bald eagles, Bruce Springsteen, all things I associate with the country of America. Yet, there is no country in the world officially called America. What we do have, however, is the landmass that covers the majority of the Western Hemisphere that is called the Americas, the two continents that make up this landmass named North America and South America, and a country in North America called the United States of America, a country that's name is often shortened to the USA, the US, and of course just America. How did so much of what we called the New World end up with America somewhere in its name? Where does the name America even come from, and who gave it that name? Now let's start things off at a slight tangent, because America wasn't always called America. The various tribes of natives in the land didn't have one set name for the continent, as the tribes spoke a variety of languages. In the language of the Kuna people, the land is called Abayala. North America specifically has been called by various Native American tribes Turtle Island, which is such an awesome name. The name America is a Latinization of the name of Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci. While Columbus reached the land before Vespucci, he deemed it to not be a new landmass at all, but connected to Asia. It was Vespucci who argued that the land he explored on his travels was in fact not connected to Asia and is part of something he called the New World. Vespucci, however, did not name this land after him. German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller created a new map of the world, one that labelled modern South America as America, in honour of Amerigo Vespucci. We can even go deeper into this subject, however. If America is named after Amerigo Vespucci, then who was Amerigo Vespucci named after? It's believed Amerigo Vespucci was named after Saint Emeric of Hungary. The supercontinent was eventually split into two smaller, but still pretty big, continents of North America and South America. So, say if you're travelling from one end of the Americas to another, from Greenland to Chile, when would you have to stop calling the land you're in North America and start calling it South America? The border of North and South America lies on the Isthmus of Panama, an isthmus being a narrow strip of land with water on both sides, and the country of Panama is generally considered to be the most southern part of North America, with Colombia being the most northern part of South America. Maybe, however, you've heard of a third name for a specific landmass of the Americas, Central America. Central America consists of 7 countries: Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and the aforementioned Panama, all of which are part of the North American continent. So what about that country we all call America, the one that's actually called the United States of America? No one knows who was the first to call it this. The first publication of the name comes from an anonymous essay in a newspaper from Virginia on April 6, 1776. The name was used again by John Dickinson in the second draft of the Article of Confederation, and in Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence he wrote the phrase United States of America, yet in the final version this was changed to the 13 United States of America. Yet just the United States of America was still used within the preamble of the Constitution. The continent of the Americas and the country of the USA have always been a place where a huge variety of people, beliefs and cultures come together, and this can be even seen from the land's name. America was named by a German, who got the name from an Italian, who was likely named after a Hungarian. It's a name that can always be a simple reminder of America's multicultural history. Brazil, a nation known for its carnivals, a huge statue of Jesus, and football, definitely not soccer. Brazil is the largest country in South America, covering over 3 million square miles. But how exactly did this colourful nation get its name? There's actually a couple ideas as to where the name comes from. One of the most out there ideas comes from Ireland, of all places. There's a legend that there was an island off the coast of Ireland that was forever cloaked in mist, except for one day every 7 years. But even then the island was still unreachable. The island had many names, but 2 of them being Ilha Brazil or just Brazil. This island can even be seen on maps dating back to the 1400s named Ilha de Brazil. So how on earth did this mystic island off the coast of the Emerald Isle end up with a name that sounds so foreign to the area in modern times? It seems to be just a coincidence of languages sharing similar sounds, as in Celtic the name Ilha Brazil originates from the word bless, which would have meant blessed land in English. Some historians even argue that the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral, who is claimed to have founded Brazil, thought he had landed on the mystic island when he got there, giving it that name in the 1500s. Yet this couldn't have been the case, as we know that at this time these explorers were calling the land by a different name, Ilha de Vera Cruz, meaning in English Island of the True Cross, as the explorers did still think they were on an island and not quite literally one of the biggest land masses on Earth. When they realised this, the name was changed to Terra de Santa Cruz, meaning Land of the Holy Cross. The land eventually came to be called Brazil and was under Portuguese control until the 7th of September 1822, when Brazil achieved their independence from the Portuguese. So how did the Portuguese end up naming Brazil that? Well, there's a type of tree the Portuguese found in Brazil they were truly amazed by. While it may look like an ordinary tree, on the inside it has a deep red hue. There are other trees that produce a red colour known of in Asia, but none of them produce the red quite like this. With red being an important colour in Portugal, the red in their flag represents the blood of the nation, this tree was highly exported back to the home country from the new land. The tree was given a name by the Portuguese, Pau Brasil, known as the Brazil wood tree in English, with stick in Portuguese being pau and the Brazil part thought to come from the Portuguese word for ember, which is brasa, with the name of just Brazil coming to refer to the whole country. How fantastic is it that this fiery, colourful, samba-loving nation was named more or less after the colour of fire itself. It has built a reputation for itself as a nation of moose, bacon, maple syrup, and of course, friendly hockey-loving people. Its name, however, has roots in the indigenous people of the land. This etymological story begins with French explorer Jacques Cartier, who was traversing the land in 1535. It was Jacques who went on to claim the land for the French. During his explorations, he came across two young indigenous men of the land. These young men told Jacques of somewhere called Canada, which at this time didn't mean the land as a whole, but rather just the village that lay north of where modern Quebec is, Stadacona, as Canada is thought to have meant just village in the Huron-Iroquois language the natives spoke. Nevertheless, it was this name that Jacques used to refer to the village he ended up in, as well as the area around it, with Canada over time becoming Canada. More and more of the area became known as Canada. Maps from this time even show St. Lawrence River being called Rivière du Canada. The parts of modern day Canada and modern day USA that were controlled by the French eventually became New France by 1616, yet the area in New France that lay between the Great River of Canada and the Gulf of St. Lawrence was still being called Canada. The name became even more official in 1791 when the province of Quebec was split into two colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, yet by 1841 they were once again reunited under the name Province of Canada. Yet when it came time for Canada to become its own independent confederation in the 17th century, a name had to be decided upon for the land north of the US border. Many were thrown into the mix, such as Toponia, Norland and Hochelaga, and even Britannia. One of particular interest is Efisga, which might seem like an incoherent mess of letters, but is actually a combination of the first letters of the people with settlements in the land: the English, French, Irish, Scottish, Germans, and of course Aboriginals. But like I said, the name is an absolute mess, so it didn't stick. It was a man by the name of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, seriously, like, what an amazing name, who fought for the already established name of Canada to be the name for the entire country, as at the time it was just the name of one of the provinces. He asked the question of how others would feel if they woke up some fine morning and found himself, instead of Canadian, a Toponian or Hochelander. With this new perspective, on July 1st, 1867, the province of Canada, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick became the single nation of Canada.
Poor old Central America. For some reason, these nations always seem to get forgotten when nations of the New World are talked about. When people think of America, their minds may automatically go to the USA, Canada and Mexico, or even think about the nations of South America like Brazil and Argentina. Though this small sliver of land sitting between these juggernauts is full of nations with their own rich histories, cultures and breathtaking scenery. Central America comprises of all the nations between Mexico and Colombia. Many even view Central America as its own region, the third America if you will. However, it seems officially, according to Wiki anyway, Central America is a sub-region / subcontinent of the larger continent of North America. I'm sure you can figure out for yourself why this region is called Central America. It's in the center of the Americas. However, you may have also heard another name for this part of the world that crops up often, that being Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica refers to the civilizations and cultures that originated from this part of the world. Tribes like the Olmec, Maya and Aztecs all originated from Mesoamerica. The land area that is usually seen as being Mesoamerica doesn't actually line up with Central America, however, as it overlaps the southern half of Mexico and dips into Costa Rica at its southernmost point. And despite sounding a tad more exotic than Central America, Mesoamerica simply means Middle America, coming from the Greek prefix for middle, meso. Anyway, despite looking like the single piece of thread that's holding together the masses of North and South America, Central America is home to 7 different nations. Of the 10 nations on mainland North America, 7 are in this area. These are the nations of Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. In the past, I believe I've only looked into a few of these nations before, so today let's give Central America the love and attention it deserves. We've looked into regions of the world in the past like Scandinavia, Iberia, and the Baltic, and done big specials on how not only these nations got their names, but their capitals too. So today it's Central America's turn to get the name explained treatment, as we look into how these nations and their capitals got their names, and I'll sprinkle in some extra etymological fun facts too, though a bit of pre-warning, the names of a lot of these capital cities aren't that unique, shall we say. And you will see that this is the case with the nation of Guatemala. This nation is best known for its volcanic landscape, Mayan culture, delicious coffee, and being the birthplace of chocolate. The land has been inhabited for well over 20,000 years, vastly predating Columbus, and while Spanish is the official language, there are 21 recognized indigenous languages in the land too. The name Guatemala is believed to derive from one of these native languages, Nahuatl to be exact. It's believed to come from their word Cuatalamalan, which means the land of many trees. The natives of course called it this as there are in fact many trees in the land, and as European settlers came along they corrupted it into Guatemala. And as for Guatemala's capital city, well, it's simply called Guatemala City. I did warn you some of these wouldn't be too interesting. However, I did find out another fun name related fact in this nation, and that's with their currency's name. The Guatemalan currency is called the quetzal, and this is also the name for the nation's national bird. The money is named after the bird not only because they like the animal there, but because in Mayan culture the feathers of these birds were supposedly used as currency, so it's fitting that in the land where Mayan culture was prominent, their money still bears the bird's name. To the east of Guatemala lies the nation of Belize. This small nation has faced a troubled history with their neighbour, however it seems they are slowly building up their tourism industry and things are getting safer there. What draws many people to this nation is their amazing beaches with a more Caribbean vibe than the rest of Central America. The nation was formerly part of the British Empire and the UK's last piece of land on mainland America up until 1981. This has left Belize as the only Central American nation with English as their official language. While it was part of the UK, it was called British Honduras. More on that name shortly. The name of Belize, however, is actually debated with many possible origins, though it seems that the most popular theory comes from the Mayan word Balish, which means muddy waters, which references the Belize River, though the other theory is that it's named after the Scottish buccaneer Peter Wallace. He used his name of Wallace, then that got corrupted into Wallace, then Vallis, then Ballas, and then Belize. Belize's capital was called Belize City, but was is the key word in all this, as this former capital city was almost completely destroyed in a 1961 hurricane. While this seemingly is back on its feet now, in the fallout of this natural disaster, the capital was moved to the city of Belmopan, which is one of the smallest capital cities in the world. This name of Belmopan is actually a combination of two other words. The first half of the name comes from the name Belize, unsurprisingly, and the latter half of the name comes from the name Mopan, the name of a river in this area. Perhaps one day Belize City will be this nation's capital once again. Also, I wonder if Belize City is the only city to share its name with the nation it is in and not be the capital of that nation. I haven't researched that, but let me know down below if that is the case or not. And as I mentioned, we will be looking into the name Honduras, which is one of the larger nations of Central America. Like other parts of Central America, Honduras is known for its ancient sites, landscape and wildlife. In fact, it's its underwater wildlife that draws so many people, as off the coast of Honduras and Belize is the second largest barrier reef on the planet, which is known as either the Belize Barrier Reef or the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef. It's safe to say that with this reef, the waters around Honduras get pretty deep, and it's from these deep waters where the name comes from, as in Spanish, Honduras means the depths/great depths, referencing these deep waters on the nation's east coast. There's even a story saying that this name comes from Columbus saying, "Thank God we came out of these depths," in Spanish of course, when leaving the country, and that the nation came from this statement specifically, but that seems to be more folktale than fact. Honduras' capital is called Tegucigalpa, but is commonly shortened to just Tegus, which is good for me because I'm terrible at the pronunciation of easy words, let alone complex ones like this. This name was initially thought to be of native origin, meaning Silver Hill, as the hills around this city were mined for silver. But the issue with this is that the natives didn't mine the silver in these hills, so why would they have named it that if they didn't know of the silver? More recent ideas have the name meaning place of painted stones, due to the stones decorated by the natives in this land, which I think sounds more accurate. However, there is another name that was given to Honduras that has since been used for other nations too, and that is the title of a banana republic. A banana republic is a term used for a nation with an unstable economy that is reliant on a single product or resource. Honduras was the original banana republic, as for some time their economy did pretty much rely solely on the growth, trade and export of their bananas. The term was coined in 1901 by American writer O. Henry when talking about how Honduras was being exploited by the American-owned United Fruit Company for their bananas. Eventually this term got applied to other nations, even when when their product wasn't bananas. And yes, there's even a clothing store called Banana Republic too. Next up, we have the smallest Central American nation by land, El Salvador. Though despite being the smallest, it's the 4th largest population. Just under 6.5 million people call this land their home. This makes El Salvador the most densely populated nation in the Americas. It is also the only Central American nation without a coast on the Atlantic Ocean. I'm sure many of you will be able to see what this name means. It's a Spanish name and simply translates into the Savior in English. This Savior is of course Jesus Christ. The land was named by Conquistador Pedro de Alvarado, and originally its full name was Provincia del Nuestro Señor Jesus Cristo El Salvador del Mundo, which in English means Province of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Luckily for people like myself who suck at pronouncing Spanish, this was shortened to just El Salvador. El Salvador's capital is simply called San Salvador, meaning Saint Savior / Holy Savior, so not the most interesting of names. However, a fun name from this land is the nickname their residents have. Officially, some of them El Salvador is called Salvadorian / Salvadoran, but their nickname is Guanaco. This is also the name of a type of llama-like mammal that lives in South America. I've heard that the nickname comes from this animal, or that comes from a native word meaning brotherhood. I've also read it's a nickname that is not beloved by people from the nation, so apologies if I upset anyone with my use of it. Let me know down below how the word is perceived if you are from El Salvador. I'd love to know. And from the smallest nation of Central America to the biggest, we have Nicaragua. This nation is home to the largest lake in Central America and Central America's oldest city, Granada, though this isn't their capital. However, Granada was founded by Conquistador Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba, who lent his name to their currency too, the Cordoba. Their actual capital is called Managua, and this name derives from a Nahuatl phrase meaning adjacent to the water, as the city is adjacent to one of the nation's large lakes. Anyway, what about the nation's name itself? Well, there seems to be a couple ideas as to where this name came from. The more popular one is that it's a combination of 2 words, these being the word Nicaro, a supposed native chief who apparently lived on these lands, and the Spanish agua, meaning water, once again a reference to the huge lakes in this nation. The second theory is that it comes from the Nahuatl phrase Nik Anauac, which means either Anauac reached this far or the Nahuas came this far. Anauac is the name for the court of the Aztecs Mexico, and Nahuas is the name for a native tribe. So if either of these are true, it implies that Nicaragua was as far as this region reached, or these people stretched out to. Next up, we have Costa Rica. This is a nation best known for its wildlife and biodiversity. It's incredible just how much wildlife resides in this small mass of land. In fact, it's thought that Costa Rica makes up 5 to 6% of the world's entire biodiversity, with it being home to more than 500,000 different animal species. They have no army, and you can watch the sun rise across the Caribbean and then set in the Pacific all in the same day. It's no surprise it's considered one of the happiest countries in the world. The land is rich in animals, sunrises and sunsets, and happiness, so it's not surprising that rich is part of its name. From just looking at this name, I'm sure you can get a good idea as to what it means. It means rich coast and was once again supposedly named by Columbus, as he thought that the coast here would be rich in precious metals. It's a very literal name, surprisingly literal some might say. Costa Rica's capital city is called San Jose, named in honor of St. Joseph. This also happens to be the most popular place name in the world, primarily due to it being used across so much land that is/was under Spanish influence. And finally, we have the southernmost nation of Central America and the gateway to South America, Panama. This nation is way more than just a canal, though said canal does generate about 1/3 of the nation's income. This bendy little nation is home to almost 1,000 bird species and over 10,000 different plant species, and the world's oldest still in use train line. But yes, that canal does allow travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa, without having to go around the entire continent, so it is pretty handy. There's a few ideas as to where the name Panama actually comes from, one of those being that it means abundance of fish, as it was initially the name of a native fishing village to start with. However, I've also read theories that means abundance of butterflies and not fish, or that it's named after a type of tree called the Panama tree, though the tree may be named after the nation. And of course, the capital of Panama is simply called Panama City, which isn't the most interesting of names. Something else to have the name Panama is a kind of hat called a Panama hat. However, the silly thing about these hats is they don't even originate from Panama, but from Ecuador. Still, as they gained popularity in the nation, the hats were named after it. Anyway, whether you're diving into the depths of Honduras, enjoying the rich coast of Costa Rica, or traversing the many trees of Guatemala, now you have a better etymological understanding of this often overlooked part of the world. Shiny and clear polished silver can be, its etymology isn't as clear. All we seem to know is that it came from older Germanic and Slavonic origins with the likes of the Old High German Syllaba and the Old Church Slavonic Syrbo. Then from here things just don't seem to be too known. However, despite this, silver has constantly been a highly desired material, used for making high quality products and for changing and bartering in the form of silver coins. Nations can be shaped by the silver in the nation, and one country has gone on to be even named after the metal. Though, which one? Well, let's look at a map and see what country's name sounds most similar to silver. The ones that come to my mind are the likes of Slovenia and Slovakia, as they both have the S, L and V sounds, though long-time name explain viewers will know these aren't named after silver, and of course why their names are similar. So why aren't these nations that sound like silver named after silver? Well, that's because of how the word silver is spelt in other languages. Despite how silver may sound similar in many languages like the English silver, Dutch zilver, German silber and Icelandic silver, the word doesn't follow this pattern across all languages. In fact, if you speak Romance language, I'm sure you already have a very clear idea as to what nation is named after silver, just from your words for silver, unless you speak Spanish, in which case the word for silver is plata, though that word for silver will come into play in this story. And if you have a good understanding of the periodic table, then you probably have a good idea as to what country is named after silver. All chemicals have a symbol associated with them. These exist so the elements can be written about using shorthand writing instead of having to constantly write out these huge long names. These symbols for elements are defined by either one or two letters, with the letter usually relating to the name of the element, like how hydrogen symbol is just an H, as hydrogen starts with an H, and the symbol for magnesium is Mg, as the M and G sounds are rather prominent in the name of magnesium. Though if you were to look for silver on the periodic table, you won't find it represented by the letters of SL or SV or anything like that. That would make way too much sense. On the periodic table, silver is represented by the letters of AG, neither of which are present in the English name of silver. These letters come from silver's Latin name, argentum, and this isn't the only letter that symbol reflects a past name rather than its modern name. We see this too with how K is the symbol for potassium, Fe for iron, Sn for tin, Sb for antimony, W for tungsten, Au for gold, Hg for mercury, and Pb for lead, all of which seem just as nonsensical as Ag being used to represent silver. This Latin name of argentum derives from the Greek argolos, which is believed to relate to the Sanskrit arja una, which means light, maybe because silver is a rather light metal in colour and weight. Descendants of this Latin name survive to this day, however, with the French argent, Italian argento, Romanian argent, and even the Esperanto argento. And I'm sure from hearing this Latin name for silver, and all these other modern words for silver, you have a good idea as to what country is actually named after silver, and that is none other than the South American nation of Argentina. At over 1 million square miles in size, Argentina is the 8th largest country on the planet, and the biggest Spanish-speaking country on the planet. I always find it weird when the nation the language is from isn't the biggest nation that speaks that language, with the best example of that being how England, one of the smallest countries, actually uses English. Seriously, I've never noticed how huge most of the other countries that have English as their main language are. And being in South America means that it's bordered by the nations of Paraguay, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile and Bolivia. Anyway, how on earth did this nation end up being named after the metal of silver? Well, while Argentina does contain a lot of silver and their silver mining industry is highly lucrative, there's actually a lot more history to it than that. Argentina was colonized by the Spanish in the 16th century. However, as we mentioned, the Spanish word for silver, despite being a Romance language too, doesn't come from the Latin argentum. It is in fact plata. An idea for the origin of this Spanish word for silver, plata, is that it comes from the Latin planus, which means flat, as the metal will be made into a flat shape. And this also relates to the words plate and plata, as they are flat too and can be made from silver. And of course relates to plains, as in the flat areas of land. It's a great example of how seemingly unrelated words can be tied via etymology. Anyway, as I was saying, it was colonized by the Spanish in the 16th century, yet their word for silver sounds nothing like the Latin argentum. So why did they call this land as something like Palatia, which ties closer to their word for silver? This is because while it was in fact colonized by the Spanish, it had already been named by the Portuguese, hence why the name sounds more similar to the Portuguese/Latin word for silver, rather than the Spanish word for the stuff. Though the Portuguese only named it after their word for silver, as the Spanish before them had named the nearby river after their word for silver. Confused? Good, I was hoping that would be the case. This would make a wee bit more sense if I told the story in more detail and in chronological order this time round. Let's start in the early 1500s. A Spanish conquistador, well actually he was Portuguese but he served Spain, by the name of Alexio Garcia heard a tale about a land in South America rife with silver. He journeyed to the New World to try and find it and bring as much silver back as possible to Spain. However, while in this land he was killed by local tribesmen. While he never made it out these lands, some of his team did, with pockets full of silver from the land. Back in Spain, the survivors surviving members of this voyage talked about this exotic land, and most noticeably a river they came across that was supposedly laced with silver on its bed. The Spanish were so tantalized by this river they named it Rio de la Plata, which means river of silver. However, this Rio de la Plata is actually an estuary and now forms part of the border between Argentina and Uruguay, and this tale of how the river got its name isn't actually certain, but something of a folk etymology. We even have other recorded names to the river like Mar Dulce, Rio de Solis, Rio de Santa Maria, and Rio Jordan. However, for one reason or another, the name Rio de la Plata is the one that has stuck around, so perhaps there is some truth to the tale and death of Alexio Garcia. This naming of the river took place in the ambiguous time period of the early 1500s, due to the fact we don't really know the whole story, though in 1554 we have clear evidence as to when the name Argentina as we know it started to take shape. It was in this year that Portuguese explorer slash cartographer Lopo Holman was exploring this part of the world. He must have known of the story of Alexio Garcia and his Silver River, so when mapping out South America, he named the land by the River of Silver the Land of Silver, which in Portuguese would have been Terra Argentea, and of course when the Spanish took over the land they adopted this name of Terra Argentea but transformed it into the Spanish Argentina, so it's a Spanish adaptation of a Portuguese name, but that Portuguese name was inspired by the Spanish name of a nearby river, which is just a tad confusing. However, before it could become the nation of Argentina, it became part of a new Spanish colony named the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, with this Viceroyalty of course being named after the river that Argentina itself was named after. Though it wouldn't stay this way for long, as by 1810 it seems that the people started turning on their Spanish rulers, thus starting the Argentine War of Independence. This civil war within the nation lasted till 1818. However, it was 2 years before that Argentina declared itself independent from Spain, and here it became the nation it is today, with noticeably the UK being one of the first nations to recognise Argentina's independence, forming a treaty of friendship, commerce and navigation between the two nations. And speaking of UK-Argentine relations, there's something I found so fascinating about Argentina that I probably wouldn't get the chance to talk about anywhere else, so I'm going to cover it here, and that's the fact that within Argentina there's a whole Welsh-speaking community, which to me is just crazy. Wales and Argentina are two countries I don't really associate with having much in common, but nevertheless the language is spoken by whole communities of people down in South America. Patagonian Welsh, more on that word in a moment, has even become a version of Welsh unto itself, and their flag is a cool mixture of the Argentine and Welsh flags. This community had its beginnings in 1865 when around 150 people from various parts of Wales emigrated to southern Argentina to start a fresh life there, and over the years more and more Welsh people emigrated to the country, setting up their own towns and communities. Wikipedia states that there are now around 50,000 Welsh Argentines. If you happen to be watching this and are Welsh Argentine, then please let me know what life is like in the Welsh part of Argentina. I'd seriously love to know. And yes, I mentioned the name of Patagonia. This is a region of South America that actually encompasses parts of Chile as well as Argentina. Of course, Argentina, like most countries, is made up of various regions, and perhaps one day we'll look into those. But to end this video, I'd like to talk just about Patagonia, as despite how interesting it is to have a country named after silver, with Patagonia we have a region of the world named after giants. Yep, the things from fairy tales with Anglo-attuned nostrils. How on earth did this land get named after something that doesn't even actually exist? This is because the area is named after a tribe who lived in the land, with this tribe being named by the Europeans the Patagons, who are believed to have actually been another group of people who, while on average were taller than Europeans, were by no means actual fee-fi-fo-fum giants. Nevertheless, the name has stuck around, and from finding out that Argentina means the land of silver and a part of it is dubbed the land of giants, I'm starting to suspect it'll be quicker to get there via beanstalk than airplane. Okay, yes, I know it's gold in the fairy tale, not silver, but come on, it's pretty close. Etymology for the Italian city of Venice isn't too clear for us. All we seem to know is that this name comes from the Veneti, a name of an ancient group of people who lived in this part of the world. Where the name for these people however come from we aren't too sure, yet nevertheless the name Venice has stuck around as the name for one of the most popular tourist destinations on the planet. And it's easy to see why Venice is so popular. I mean, I haven't been there myself, but just from looking at photos of this city you can see it's a seriously unique part of the world, from its beautiful architecture, bridges, cobble streets, and of course its gondola-ridden canals. It makes me wonder how a city so unique like this could even be built to begin with. Venice's history seems to begin with the fall of the Roman Empire. The people of mainland Italy had enjoyed a prosperous life under Roman rule. However, when the empire came to an end, barbarians of northern Europe came upon these people. Of course, it would have been those in northern Italy who would have felt these forces first. They found refuge from these barbarians by establishing a settlement off the coast of Italy. It was in this isolation that these Italians could thrive and build up their own community. On the 25th of March 421 AD, Venice was formally created. It was a city built out of fear for what was happening in their homeland, but is now one of the most beautiful cities on our planet. And Venice's unique look has sparked comparisons across the globe. There are many places on planet Earth that have also been called Venice. There are tons of places in the United States of America that have been dubbed Venice. The states of Florida, Illinois, Washington, Louisiana, Missouri, Nebraska, New York, Ohio, and Utah all have a Venice in them. Though the most famous Venice, outside of the actual Venice, is probably the neighborhood of Venice in Los Angeles, California, including the famous Venice Beach. This Venice was founded in 1905 by a tobacco millionaire named Abbot Kinney. Kinney transformed what was a marshy beachland into a top tourist attraction and still is to this day. Due to the canals he constructed, it was referred to as the Venice of America, and now it has been shortened to just Venice. Yet there aren't Venices in just Italy and the USA. There's a hamlet called Venice in Alberta, Canada, and even a village in Zimbabwe that has this name too. There's even replicas of Venice in Las Vegas and Tokyo Disneyland. Well, actually it's in the Disney Sea Park, but shush. It seems that wherever you go in the world you will find a Venice one way or another. And when somewhere isn't actually called Venice, they can have Venice in their nickname. Many places are referred to as being the Venice of their geographic location. Many places have been dubbed the Venice of the North, such as Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and even Birmingham here in England. The Venice of the East is a title that has been given to cities in Asia like Osaka and Bangkok. Shanghai has been called the Venice of the Orient, Avaliel the Venice of Portugal, Fort Lauderdale the Venice of America, Recife the Brazilian Venice, and there's even Malé Poitevin, a marshland in France known as the Green Venice. Like I said, you really can't seem to escape Venices across the globe. Why are so many places even referred to as a Venice? Well, it seems because in all these places, waterways and canals are aplenty, much like the original Venice in Italy. However, while it's all well and good having settlements named after Venice or having nicknames that mention Venice, they pale in comparison to a whole country on our planet being named after Venice. Yep, that's correct. We have a whole country on our planet called Venice. Well, kind of. It's not literally called Venice. If you look on a map, you won't find a country simply labelled Venice. However, its name does sound somewhat similar to Venice, and it's none other than the South American country of Venezuela. Venezuela is a northern country of South America. To its west is Colombia, Guyana to its east, and Brazil to its south. It's over 900 square kilometers in size with a population of over 30 million. The country is also located within the tropical belt, and because of this, the nation has a huge rare biodiversity. Animals from crocodiles, bears, bird life, anteaters, and even sloths can be found in the nation. And of course, people could be found in the nation too, over 30 million as I just mentioned earlier. Someone who is from Venezuela is unsurprisingly called Venezuelan. However, the most popular ethnic group of Venezuela is Mestizo. This is an ethnicity and a name I'd never heard of before, so I decided to look into it. The name apparently refers to those of mixed ancestry of various European and indigenous peoples of America, and apparently means mixed in Spanish, which I personally found interesting. I'm always excited to come across a name I didn't know beforehand. Anyway, how on earth did this nation in South America end up being named after a city in Italy? Well, for this name to be explained, we need to go back in time to 1499. It was in this year that Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, yes, that one, and Spanish navigator Alonso de Ojeda led a naval expedition in South America, specifically in the northwestern coast of what is now Venezuela. It was while on this expedition they came across a village built by the native Anu people of this land. However, there was something unique about this village. It wasn't like any old village. Instead of being built on land, the houses and buildings of this village were built on stilts over the waters of Lake Maracaibo. These kinds of houses are actually known in Spanish as a palafito. The residents of this village moved around their settlement via bridges and canoes. This of course rang a bell in Amerigo Vespucci's head. With the settlement being on water and people getting around via bridges and boats, only one location come to mind for an Italian like Vespucci, that of course being Venice in his homeland of Italy. And it was due to this similarity to Venice as to why this part of the world would end up being named after the city. When Amerigo first named it, he dubbed it Venezuela, which means Little Venice in Italian, though as the area came under Spanish rule, the Italian Zuela suffix was changed to the Spanish Zuela suffix, which in Spanish is a diminutive suffix. So yes, the name Venezuela actually means Little Venice, which is kind of funny to modern ears, as while that initial village they discovered was way smaller than actual Venice, as the years have gone by, the country that came from this discovery and bears the name of Little Venice is way bigger than actual Venice. Perhaps their name should be changed around or something to be more accurate to their sizes. Though, as fun as this story is, and the fact that it's become the most popular explanation of how the name Venezuela came to be, it might not actually be true. There's actually another etymology for the nation's name, and it comes once again from the same 1499 trip, specifically a member of their crew, someone by the name of Martin Fernandez de Encisco. In his writings called Summa de Geografia, he wrote how while exploring this part of the world, they discovered an indigenous people who were called the Venic peculiar, and that the name Venezuela derives from the name of these people, much like how Venice itself was named after the native people now that I think about it. However, it's the Little Venice etymology that's picked up the most traction, and is the one people genuinely accept to be the true etymology, and besides it's a really fun story about how this country got its name, and if there's anything we love most here on Name Explain, is when something has a really interesting fun story as to how it got its name. As a nation, Venezuela was under control of the Spanish, however by the 1800s this started to change. To begin with, in 1806 a failed revolution in Venezuela took place, and while this didn't work out for the revolutionaries, it planted the seeds in the people's mind that independence was possible, and Venezuela was actually quite ahead of the times in regards to claiming independence in South America. The first country to claim independence in South America was Colombia in 1810, and here we have a failed revolution in Venezuela just 4 years before that. 2 years after that failed revolution, however, in 1808, Venezuela got some unlikely assistance in their fight for independence. This assistance was in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte and his invasion of Spain, in which he put his own brother Joseph on the throne as King of Spain. This upheaval of monarchy in Spain threw the nation and its colonies into chaos. Many of the people of Spain and its colonies were still loyal to their previous king and didn't know how to react to this change. This chaos grew in Venezuela too when a representative of King Joseph Bonaparte came to the land and demanded that Venezuela recognizes him as their king. In 1810, this led to the people of Venezuela demanding self-rule free from the Spanish monarchy, aka the Bonapartes. This resulted in provisional independence being signed on the 19th of April 1810 and full independence on July 5th, 1811, making it the third country in South America to gain independence, just behind Paraguay and Colombia. However, it did remain part of a republic known as Gran Colombia up until 1930, and then in 1945 it was recognized as a country and joined the United Nations. In 1999, they took on the full official name of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The Bolivarian part of this name comes from Simon Bolivar, a hugely important figure across South America and helped many nations gain independence there. In fact, the 6 South American nations of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, which yes I know isn't technically South America, Peru and Bolivia are sometimes collectively known as the Bolivarian countries, as their ideas of being a republic stem from Simon Bolivar's ideals. And of course, Bolivia itself is named after Simon Bolivar, which I think we talked about in a previous video. I can't remember anymore. Future Patrick while animating this video will find out for you. And that is the story of how a country in South America ended up being named after a city in Italy, due to the similarities between a water-filled village there and a water-filled city in Italy. And of course the name Amerigo Vespucci was Italian himself, so I think that gives it another reason as to why it was named after Venice. I personally like to think that if an English person discovered it, the country to this day would still be called Little Birmingham. Religion has always played a large role in human history. Even parts of our world are named after religious figures. This is without doubt most prominent in the Caribbean. Within the Caribbean Sea, there are some island nations that are named after saints of Christianity. Of course, anyone versed in the history of the Caribbean will have a pretty good understanding as to why so many of these island nations are named after saints. It of course all comes down to Christopher Columbus. He named so much of the New World, and these names are a relic of his time in the Caribbean. Columbus was a fiercely religious man, so it only makes sense that he would name so many places after saints. One article from Christianity Today delves into Columbus's religious views and says that he and his crew would finish each day by singing Vespers, and specifically mentioned that unlike many other sailors, Columbus never swore. To start with, we have the island nation of St. Lucia, which was named after St. Lucy of Syracuse. Little seems to be known of St. Lucy and her life, other than that she was killed during Christian persecutions in the early 4th century. By the 6th century, she was recognized by the church for her courage in defense of her faith. This also means that St. Lucia is the only country in the world to be named after a woman. Well, there's Ireland too, but that was named after a mythological woman. While just one country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, is a nation of 2 names, with of course the part of the name we're more interested in being the St. Vincent part of it. Columbus named the nation after St. Vincent of Saragossa due to the fact that Columbus sighted the island on the 22nd of January, which is St. Vincent's feast day. I couldn't find too much on the latter part of the name, but it seems that the Grenadines part of the name comes from the city of Granada in Spain. If you look up a list of saints, you won't find any called St. Kitts, so how did we end up with a country called St. Kitts and Nevis? Well, while we don't have a St. Kitts, we do have a St. Christopher, and in the 17th century, Kitts was a popular nickname for Christopher, so while Columbus named the island St. Christopher, over time it simply became St. Kitts, and that name stuck with it through history. The Nevis part of this name, however, isn't too clear to us. It apparently comes from a Spanish Catholic phrase which means Our Lady of the Snows, though we aren't too sure why it was named this and who even named it. In fact, it's even debated if Columbus called St. Kitts that, with some believing he named it Santiago after St. James. One of interest is Dominica. Some sources point out that the island was named after St. Dominic. However, others claim that Columbus didn't name this island after a religious figure, but rather a religious day. Sources claim that the name Dominica comes from the Latin term Dis Dominica, which means Sunday, as he first sighted the island on a Sunday. It must be remembered that the island nation of Dominica is a completely different country to the nation of the Dominican Republic, but that mix-up can be saved for another time.
Paraguay and Uruguay are two countries that are not only close together geographically, but close together phonetically. Both nations have pretty similar names. In fact, the last 4 letters of each name are identical. Guay. What does this Guay in Paraguay and Uruguay mean? Where did it come from, and why did one nation get the Para prefix and the other get the Uru prefix? Paraguay and Uruguay are both named after rivers that run through their respective countries. This is thought to be where the Guay part of their name comes from. Now, my favourite thing in the world is totally information that clashes with each other. When one source says one thing and another source says something else, my favourite. This is the issue I run into with finding out what Guay means. Guay comes from the Guarani language, as do both full names for the two countries, yet what Guay represents in each country's name seems to differ. It definitely, however, has aquatic origins. The general consensus is that Guay means a river in Guarani. Variation on this is that the Gua part means from or belonging to, and the Y part means water. We go further into the confusion of Guay when we figure out where Paraguay comes from. There is no consensus on where the name Paraguay exactly comes from. One idea is that it means born from water, with the Para part meaning water and the Guay part this time meaning born in the Guarani language. Are you understanding my confusion about Guay now? Of course, like I said, there are other ideas on where the name comes from. Another idea is that it comes from an indigenous tribe that lived along the Paraguay River, the Payagos, or even their leader, Paraguayo. So what about Uruguay? Well, Uruguay is of course named after the Uruguay River that runs through the country. Unlike Paraguay, it seems to be genuinely agreed that the Guay in this case it does mean river. So what does Uru mean then? Originally Uru was thought to be some kind of beautiful bird that lived along the river. Recently, however, it's thought to in fact refer to a type of extinct snail that were plentiful in the river. So of course there are some key similarities in the origins of these two names. They both derive from the same language and they're both named after rivers, with the general consensus being that the Guay part of their names are referring to the rivers. But from there it divides from things like being born from the water and tribes to beautiful colourful birds and mundane water snails.
In the Caribbean Sea we have 2 nations. Well, I mean there's a fair few others too, but for the sake of this video we are looking at just 2 of them. These are of course the nations of the Dominican Republic and Dominica, and you don't need to look too hard as to see why these 2 names are of so much interest to us. They're identical minus the N and the Republic at the end of the Dominican Republic. It's not only their names that are close together, but the nations are close together geographically too, both being in the archipelago of the Antilles, specifically the Greater and Lesser Antilles for the Dominican Republic and Dominica respectively. How this name came about is somewhat unknown, however. Some believe it comes from the Gaelic An Antiella, which means waterland, while others like to argue that the name links to Plato's fictional island of Atlas, known today as Atlantis. Dominica is a completely separate island nation in the Caribbean, while the Dominican Republic is the eastern part of the larger island of Hispaniola, with the separate nation of Haiti on the eastern side of this island. And we will look into the name for this island as a whole in a bit. And while their names are similar, there's a name they share which are exactly the same, that being the name for the people who live there. People from the Dominican Republic are called Dominicans, and people from Dominica are also called Dominicans, which is just a little bit confusing. However, one source I read told me that while these names look the same, they're actually pronounced differently. With Dominicans from the Dominican Republic, the me syllable is stressed, while Dominicans from Dominica, the ni syllable is stressed, Dominica and Dominica respectively. Yet despite the similarities in the name for these lands and the name for their people, there are many differences between them. The sort of things that differentiate most countries. They have different official languages, with Spanish being the official language of the Dominican Republic and English being the official language of Dominica, along with a variation of French called Dominican Creole French, hence why the name is said with something of a French accent to it, and not said as a Dominica as I would have been tempted to say if I didn't check beforehand. Their populations are vastly different, with the Dominican Republic having over 10 million people, while Dominica has just over 70,000. The nations are vastly different in size, with different currencies and ethnic groups. And of course, one of the biggest differences in the nation being their names. Despite how similar their names are, there's the whole additional word of republic added to the Dominican Republic, and conversely Firstly, with Dominica, its full name is actually the Commonwealth of Dominica. So what makes one a republic and one a commonwealth? Dominica is called a commonwealth because it was once part of the British Empire, and now a lot of the nations that were part of this empire are now part of a new collection of nations called the Commonwealth, while a republic is defined as a government or state whose leader is not part of a monarchy, and the people of the nation are entitled to vote. The Dominican Republic fits this bill, so the name makes sense. Though Dominica does also have elections, prime minister and president, so it fits the bill as a republic too. I guess the importance of it being part of the Commonwealth becomes before it being a republic. So that may be the differences between these nations and the key differences in their names. However, we aren't interested in differences here on Name Explain. We want to know about similarities. So how did these nations end up with these names, and are there any connections between the two? To start off, let's look into the history of the Dominican Republic. While of course the lands of the Dominican Republic were inhabited by natives first, it would make more sense for us to start this story in 1492. It was in this year the island was first visited by Europeans, and by Europeans I mean none other than Mr. Christopher Columbus himself. It was he who gave this island as a whole the name of Hispaniola. This name comes from the unsurprisingly Spanish La Isla Española, which I have read from different sources to mean either the Spanish island or Little Spain. Regardless of whichever one of these names are correct, we can see in this name the importance Columbus and the Spanish put on the island, naming it directly after their homelands. And there is a key reason for this, and that's because this was the first land in North America settled by the Spanish, and for a while it would become their hub of operation for controlling and overseeing the rest of their conquest for the Americas. And because of this, they needed a city on the island to work out of. This came 4 years after Columbus found the island in 1496, and this city was founded by Columbus. Not Christopher, however, but rather Bartholomew Columbus, Christopher's younger brother. This city was named Santo Domingo, a name we'll get into later, and this city grew and grew, like I said, becoming the hub of the Spanish conquest, and Santo Domingo to this day is still the capital of the nation. As the Spanish explored more of the New World, other European nations wanted a slice of this American pie. In the case of the island of Hispaniola, it was the French. They set up a colony on the western side of the island, and with this came anger between the two nations of France and Spain over the claim to the island. However, this came to a head in 1697 with the Treaty of Ryswick, named after the Dutch city of Ryswick where it was signed, that split the island between the French and the Spanish. The western French side of the island became Haiti, run by the French, while the eastern Spanish side of the island became known as a whole by the name of its largest city, Santo Domingo. This led to the end of the completely Spanish-ruled Hispaniola, and while that name still exists, it is only used as a geographic term for the island as a whole, and I don't believe it holds any political power or anything like that. And this is how things stayed on the island all the way until 1795, when Spain ceded their part of the island to the French. Yet by 1808 it would be taken over by the Spanish yet again. Then from 1822 to 1844, Haiti and Santo Domingo would reunify. However, it would be in 1844 that the Santo Domingo part of the nation would become independent for the first time, and it was here for the first time they took on the name the Dominican Republic. And from here the nation has been once again taken by the Spanish, occupied by the USA, and of course once again become independent. However, for the sake of the name Dominican Republic, we can probably wrap things up here. So what about that name Dominican Republic? Well, as we mentioned, this name for the nation as a whole is a variation of the capital's name, Santo Domingo. So what we really need to look into is how this city got this name. Well, just looking at this name can give us a pretty clear idea. Many places in the Caribbean are named after saints, and this one is no exception. You don't even need to be fluent in Spanish to look at this name and see that it translates into Saint Dominic, who is unsurprisingly the patron saint of the Dominican Republic. He is also the founder of the Dominican Order, an order that promoted a life of simplicity in Christianity in 1216. So the Dominican Republic was named after the city of Santo Domingo, which was named after Saint Dominic. So how did Saint Dominic get his name? The name Dominic comes from the Latin Dominicus, which literally translates to pertaining to the Lord, so it makes sense that a saint would have this name. This roots back further to the Latin Dominus, which means Lord/Master, and this is the same root that Sunday, considered the holy day for Christians, gets its name in Latin, with Sunday's name in Latin being Dominica. And that brings us nicely to the next nation we'll be looking into today, the small island nation of Dominica, which shares its name exactly with the Latin word for Sunday. And this nation isn't named after Saint Dominic this time. The story goes that Columbus, Christopher once again this time, sailed past the island on the 3rd of November 1493, which of course was a Sunday. So in celebration of finding this island on a Sunday, he named it after the holiest of days, but obviously in Latin. If it was just named Sunday Island, that would be tantalizing. And unlike Hispaniola/Santo Domingo/the Dominican Republic, this name hasn't changed, and Dominica has been the name for this island since. Despite finding the island, the Spanish actually didn't have much success with colonizing it. Instead, it was the French who had success taking over it first. They held on to the island from 1715 till 1763. However, the island got caught up in the 7-Year War, a massive war which was fought from 1756 to 1763 that spanned a lot of the globe and was battled between the British and French, each with allied kingdoms and empires on their sides. It was eventually won by the British, and when the Treaty of Paris was signed, the island of Dominica was handed over to the British. It was under British rule that English started to become the main language of the island as it is today, and as part of the British Empire it would remain, all the way up until 1978 when the nation gained independence from the Brits. However, as we saw in its name, the nation is still part of the Commonwealth, along with many other former British Empire nations. So what connects these two nations' names? Well, weirdly enough, it seems to be Sunday, which really isn't what I expected going into this video. Dominica is literally named after Sunday, and so is the Dominican Republic, albeit via Saint Dominic and his order whose name shares etymological ties with the Latin word for Sunday. But it does make sense in a weird way. They were both named by Columbuses, and they were a deeply religious family. Sunday is a deeply religious day, so it seems fitting. I can't imagine Dominica would have got this name if it was spotted on any other day of the week. Hump Day Island just doesn't sound as nice. However, despite the similarities in their names and a shared history of Columbus and the French, it seems that their names being similar is just another coincidence of language, one being named after a day and one being named after a person who would go on to be their patron saint. Islands off the coast of South America in the Caribbean Sea are called Trinidad and Tobago. So what's so weird about that? Well, these two islands come together to form one nation. Once again, there's nothing too special about this. There are many nations that consist of two or more islands. Indonesia, an example, is made up of a ton of islands and parts of islands. What differentiates this island nation from others is that this island nation doesn't have a collective name like Indonesia does. The country that consists of the islands of Trinidad and Tobago is simply called Trinidad and Tobago. Why on earth is this the case? Well, first off, let's look at how those two names came to be in the first place. Starting off with the bigger of the two islands, Trinidad. This name comes from Christopher Columbus, who named so much of the Caribbean. When he came across the island, he named it La Isla de la Trinidad, which means the island of the Trinity, and over time the name was just shortened to Trinidad. So why was it named after the Trinity? What Trinity is he talking about? Well, Christopher Columbus was a devout Catholic after all. The Trinity in Trinidad's name is of course in reference to the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son and Holy Ghost. Columbus named the island this due to a religious vow he made before leaving for his third voyage, where he discovered Trinidad. The name Tobago doesn't seem to have one definitive etymology, but all the possible etymologies derive from the same thing, that of course being tobacco. Like Trinidad, it too comes from Spanish. The Spanish word it comes from being tobacco, the Spanish word for tobacco. So why was this island named after the smokable plant? There's a couple reasons as to why this is the case. The most popular reason seems to be due to how tobacco was grown and smoked by the natives, but I also read the theory that it was due to the fact the island is shaped like a cigar, which I can kind of see. Anyway, that's where the names of these two islands come from. But why is it that when they come together to form one nation, they don't have a unique name, but just keep their own? Well, that has a lot to do with the history of the islands. While both islands were in fact discovered by the Spanish, many other empires and nations ruled over the islands. At first, Spain ruled both the islands. However, by 1797, the island of Trinidad was surrendered to the British and became a crown colony in 1802. Tobago came under French rule in 1781, and this is where France and Britain started playing hot potato with the island. Britain took it back in 1793, France regained it in 1802, and finally Britain reclaimed it once again in 1814. Now, both islands were under the rule of the British Empire, but being controlled as two separate entities, and both prospering. However, Tobago's prosperity started running dry due to its sugar industry coming more or less to an end because of the abolishment of slavery. No longer able to support itself, the island of Tobago joined up with the still prospering island of Trinidad to form the single crown colony of Trinidad and Tobago in 1888. And this is how the island nation was all the way until 1962, when the nation gained independence from the British Empire, and in 1976 officially becoming the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. While free of British rule, they however still kept the name that the British used for their crown colony, not picking one name to reflect both nations, but just stuck with Trinidad and Tobago, the single nation with two names. Regardless of how you spell it, is the name of a multitude of things, though the chilies we are looking into today are chili the country, chili the peppers, chili the meal, and chili the temperature. Okay, so that last one is more of an adjective than a noun, but hey, 3 out of 4 being names isn't too bad, right? So let's start with the country of Chile.
While there is no consensus, there's a fair few ideas as to where the name comes from. These ideas include the name coming from the 16th century Spanish chronicler Diego de Rosales, with his belief that the name came from what the Incas called the Valley of Aconcagua, Chile, which in turn he thought to be a corruption of the name of a leader from another tribe in that area, this leader being called Tili. Another idea is that the name is onomatopoeic from a type of bird song from the trill, also known as the yellow-winged blackbird, that is also found in Chile. Another couple ideas are that the name come from words in local languages of the land, one of these local languages being the Quechua language. It could have come from the Quechua word chile or chili, meaning cold/snow. Perhaps we'll come back to this one later. Or the Quechua word shui, meaning border. Or it could have come from the Aymara language word Chile, which means end of the world, place most far away, or the lowest place on earth, in reference to the southern tip of Chile being one of the lowest points on earth. The name of the country, however, seems to have no relation to the name of the type of hot and spicy peppers that are called chili peppers, though not all peppers are chili peppers, like the not so hot red, yellow and green bell peppers. There are many ways that the name chili can be spelled, whether that be with one eye or two eyes, or even spelled in the same way as the country. However, they can also be known as just simply chilies. Chilies are thought to be thousands of years old, first thought to be grown and cultivated in Mexico as early as 3500 BCE. Chilies came to be known by the rest of the world thanks to Christopher Columbus and his voyage to India that ended up with him, casually discovering America. The aim when he reached India was to bring back spices such as black pepper back from India to his country. Columbus not only mistook America for India, but also mistook chili peppers and black pepper spice. One source says that it was because of this mix-up they became known as chili peppers, but a lot more sources point to the English word chili simply coming from their Aztecan name, Chile. And of course, the cultivation of the chili pepper led to the creation of the meal chili con carne, which to a lot of people is also called just chili. Chili con carne has incredibly bizarre history, starting in the 1600s with Sister Maria de Aguilera in Spain. She was also known as the mystical Lady in Blue, and while she never left her homeland of Spain, she supposedly presented herself to New Worlders in religious visions. And in these religious visions, she talked of a red fiery stew that would eventually become known as chili con carne. Spanish priests, however, were not happy with this new meal and branded it the soup of the devil, which only made the meal much more tempting. By the 19th century, chili was the go-to food for cowboys and bandits, and only rising in popularity at the end of the Civil War. I tell you this fun story as the etymology of chili con carne is pretty boring. It is simply Spanish for chili with meat. So one of the weirdest things I've always felt about the word chili is this. When you hear it, do you think hot, like a spicy chili pepper, or cold, like the term chili? Though chili is an adjective, it comes from chill, and while chill can be a verb, e.g. let the food chill for 15 minutes, chill has root as a noun, as in there's a chill in the air. Chill has its root in the Proto-Indo-European girl, meaning cold/to freeze. Yet let's go back to that verb chill, which since the 20th century has taken on different meanings. Chill, first meaning relax, was seen in 1979. Chill meaning hang out came from around 1985. And of course Netflix and chill, peaking in around October 2015, but that's way off topic. While I found nothing online linking the two, it was interesting to see that one of the ideas for the country of Chile's etymology comes from the Quechua word for snow/cold. Yet of course, these are just 4 things that are called Chile. We also have towns like Chile, Indiana, Chile, New York, Chile, Ohio, Chile, Wisconsin, Chile, Illinois, and Chile Gulch in California. Even people have been called Chile, like actress Chile Boucher, Taiwanese gangster Chen Chi-Li, come on Wikipedia, that one's a little bit of a stretch, motorcycle racer Pierre Francesco Chile, and baseball player Chile Davis. And of course, Chile is the name of a chain of restaurants, a cartoon penguin, and of course a funk rock band. Chili peppers can be incredibly versatile when cooking, being able to be used in a wide variety of dishes, and I guess the actual word chili itself can be just as versatile. Capital cities of countries tend to have rather unique names, but that logic seems to go out the window when we look at Mexico and its capital, called Mexico City. The capital of America isn't called America City, the capital of Germany isn't called Germany City, and the capital of England isn't called England City. So why is it we have this Central American country that's capital city has the same name as the country itself? Well, the reason this seems so weird is because we, well, I am anyway, are looking at this the wrong way round. The capital city wasn't named after the country, but rather the country was named after the capital city. So how did Mexico City come to be? And of course, what does that name of Mexico even mean? Well, we aren't too sure exactly where the name comes from, but we have a couple ideas. The first of these ideas is that the name comes from the name of the Aztec god Huitzilopochtli, maybe I said that right, who is the god of war, sun, and human sacrifice. Now I know that sounds nothing like the name Mexico, but that's because this god actually had a couple other not as well known names, Mexili and Mexility. It's from these names for the god we got Mexico, which is thought to mean a place where Huitzilopochtli resides. The second idea for the name Mexico comes from is from the Nahuatl language, with it being a combination of the Nahuatl Metzli meaning moon and Zikli meaning navel. It's thought that these words put together mean either the navel of the moon, the place at the center of the moon, or even the child of the moon. So like I said, the country of Mexico was named after Mexico City, but Mexico City wasn't originally called that. In fact, there was a completely different city entirely on the land. This was the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, originally known as Mexico Tenochtitlan. Yes, that does sound like I'm saying something rude. Let's just move on with it. This city was established in 1325 on an island in the center of Lake Texcoco by a group of Aztecs also called the Mexicars. The legend goes that the aforementioned god Huitzilopochtli ordered his priests to look for where the prickly pear cactuses grew and there build a temple in his honor. It's because of this the name Tenochtitlan is believed to mean among the prickly pears growing among rocks. This city is thought to have been a thing of beauty, with a market that thousands would visit every day, trading things like gold and silver. The city became the center of the Aztec Empire, but unfortunately the city was more or less leveled and destroyed in 1521 by Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez. He however realized the importance of the location of the city he destroyed, so founded a new Spanish city on its site. He named this city after a part of the original Aztec name for their city, calling it Mexico City, which was the start of the city that stands there to this day. Along with Mexico City, the Spanish also founded their colony of Nueva España, New Spain, that at its peak covered the majority of modern Mexico and parts of modern US. The land area of Mexico was ruled by the Spanish under New Spain until 1821, when after over 11 years of war, Mexico gained its own independence, with Mexico City becoming its capital, and just Mexico becoming the name of the country, leading to the confusing state of Mexico City being the name of the capital of Mexico. However, this isn't the only country that's capital city has the same name as it. A couple other examples of this is that the capital of Luxembourg is Luxembourg City, the capital of Kuwait is Kuwait City, and the capital of Panama is Panama City. Yet it was Mexico and Mexico City that we looked into today.
Hey, have you ever wondered where the word news comes from? As in the kind of information you read in papers and see on the television? Well, we actually have two ideas as to where it comes from. Both of these ideas is that news is an acronym. One idea is as an acronym of North, East, West, South, because news comes from all over the land. And the other idea is as an acronym of notable events, weather and sports, as those are the key topics usually covered in the news. Though which one of these is the actual true origins of the word news? It has to be one of them, right? Well, no, neither of them are true. Both of these are purposefully made up ideas as to where the word news came from. This is something known as folk etymology. Folk etymology is when an idea for a word's origin seemingly sprouts out of nowhere with little to no evidence and gains traction. A lot of the time these folk etymologies become more well known than the word's actual origins and get passed along from person to person without any clue that they are spreading information that simply isn't accurate. To start with, these spread from people actually speaking to one another, but of course they would spread through written and spoken sources too, and in more recent times they are spread online through social media sharing. It's a very good time in history to be a folk etymology right now. The term folk etymology was coined in 1852 by German historian, mathematician and linguist Ernst Fustermann. As he was German, the word was German initially too, being Volksetymologie. It was then translated into English to become folk etymology. I imagine this name was chosen for these untrue word origins, as folk has become something of an adjective meaning having unknown origins, like we see with folktale, folklore and folk hero. And to me, folk etymologies conjure up the same sort of feeling and ideas that folk tales do too. Folk etymologies come about through all kinds of means. A lot of the time we don't know where exactly they come from. That's what makes them so troubling. However, sometimes we have more evidence as to where they come from. Words are given back formations, have acronyms applied to them, or are claimed to be named in someone's honour, or people just come to logical conclusions based on the word themselves. A great example is with hamburger. A lot of people presume that because hamburgers are a meat-based food, and ham is a name for a kind of meat, then the name must come from there. However, hamburger's name has nothing to do with a pig's meat, but relates to the German city of Hamburg. A lot of the time, folk etymology is people simply filling in the gaps in information for themselves. Folk etymologies remain popular because, in all honesty, they're just pretty fun. Folk etymologies are a pretty neat, compact, fun, shareable story that makes you go, huh, that is interesting. In fact, they're usually so interesting and neat that you feel compelled to share them with other people, thus perpetuating the false narrative. Real etymologies, unfortunately, aren't that fun. A lot of words come from ancient, murky, unknown origins. Trust me, if all etymologies were as fun as folk etymologies, I'd be way more successful. Take the actual etymology of news. It comes from the adjective of new, as news tends to be new events. This adjective came into English through old words of Germanic origin, like the Middle Dutch nieuw and the Gothic nieuws, ultimately coming from the Proto-Indo-European nieuw, but unknown beyond that. Like I said, this is nowhere near as fun as the folk etymology. No one is sharing that fact with their mates at the pub, or tweeting it with a shocked emoji in hopes to get retweets. It's a pretty boring piece of information, and the folk etymology is way more fun. And in all honesty, I really like folk etymologies. I know that might seem odd, in fact this whole video concept might seem strange. Name Explains a channel all about finding the true origins of words, so a video focusing on fake etymologies might seem like a slap in the face. That's why we should only talk about folk etymology, as long as we iterate that these ideas or word origins aren't real and explain why they aren't real. Folk etymology, however, is a pretty big feature in language and does have linguistic importance in its own right. Folk etymology shows us just how creative people can be with language, the understanding people have of things like acronyms, back formation and eponyms to fill in the gaps of word origins. While folk etymologies aren't true, it's hard to argue that they aren't creative, and creativity in language is something that separates us from the rest of the animal world. I'd really recommend the book Word Myths by David Wilton if what I spoke about so far interests you, and it's from this book that I found out about the main folk etymologies I want to share with you all today. If you happen to be watching in the future, this video went live on the 3rd of July 2020, just one day before the 244th Independence Day of the United States of America. And to celebrate this fact, I want to share 2 popular folk etymologies that are attached to the name America, and of course, most importantly, explain why we know these etymologies aren't true. Before we talk about the folk etymologies, however, do we know the actual true origins of the name America? Well, yes. I actually made a whole video about the name many years ago, but let's have a quick recap of the facts before we step into the fiction. This name came about way before the USA was a thing, as remember, while this nation is known as America, so is the entire landmass it is on that contains not only the USA, but also Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Honduras, etc. This land is called the Americas and is usually split between the 2 continents of North and South America. The nation of the USA contains the word America because it's a series of states that are united on the landmass of America. The landmass of the Americas has the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci to thank for its name. But why him exactly? When you think of people pivotal to the history of the Americas, I'm sure other names come to mind first. In example, Columbus. He named so much of this part of the world, and so much of this part of the world is named after him. Why not name the entire thing Columbus? Well, while Christopher Columbus arrived in the land before Amerigo in 1492, he famously thought he had found another, faster route to Asia. Amerigo Vespucci made 2 trips to the land after Columbus. First in 1499 and again in 1501. It was a few years later in some letters he published that put forward a radical new idea that flew in the face of Columbus. Amerigo Vespucci hypothesized that the land Columbus quote unquote discovered was not a part of Asia, but rather entirely new land undiscovered by Europeans until then. And over time it was discovered that Vespucci was correct in his idea, and the land was its own continent and not a part of Asia. He dubbed this new land Novus Mundus, meaning New World. And of course the New World is a name the Americans did/still do kind of go by, and this name of New World was coined by Amerigo, so he did name the land, but not after himself. It wouldn't be till 1507 that the land would be named after him. It was in this year that German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller published a brand new world map which showed the New World as a separate entity. However, he also labelled this part of the world as America in honour of Amerigo Vespucci, and from here the name has stuck around. This is the origin accepted by pretty much everyone, though as I said there are other theories. One of these were perpetuated by French geologist Jules Marcou. He became convinced that the name America came from the Américo people and the Américo Mountains in Nicaragua in Central America. Marcou argued that Columbus had met these people and seen these mountains on his 4th visit to the land and took this name back to Europe with him. It sounds pretty convincing, right? America does sound an awful lot like America, and Columbus did visit and interact with these people. It makes all the sense in the world for this land to be named after people who live there, or a geographical feature like mountains, as many places are named after these things. Yet it simply isn't the case, and we believe this for a few reasons. First, we have no record of Columbus bringing this name back with him, and we have no proof of Columbus using the name America or anything like it. Also, the name America only came into use in Europe in 1874, just a year prior to Marco publishing his theory, and over 300 years after Wärtsilä map came out. It was first seen in Europe on a map by English scientist Thomas Belt, who labelled that part of Nicaragua as Amelicu. Belt didn't coin this word, it's of unknown native origins. Marco saw this map and ran with his theory. Years later, Belt even wrote to Marco and explained that he believed that the names of America and Amelicu sounding similar is nothing more than a coincidence, and in all honesty, most people believe this too. Coincidences might seem boring, but sometimes that really is the case. Arguments have been put forward that with the amount of native languages in the land at the time, it was inevitable that one of the words would sound like America, and other theories are that the spelling and pronunciation of America was influenced by Europe to sound more like America after that name had already been coined. While that's that etymology debunked, there is a second theory, and that is that it comes from the surname of a Bristolian merchant of the 15th century, Richard Emmerich, whose surname you will also find spelled like this too. What did Richard have to do with America? Well, we aren't exactly sure, but he seems to have played a role in the 1497 and 1498 voyages of John Cabot, the Italian who is seen as being the quote-unquote discoverer of North America. In these expeditions, it's thought America had something to do with finances, as the evidence we have of him is from him signing Cabot's pension payment. This theory gained traction in 1908 thanks to Bristol historian Alfred E. Hudd. His primary evidence is a city record dating back to 1497, talking about Cabot's journey and calling the land America. This was in 1497, and Vespucci visited the land for the first time in 1499, and it was named after him in 1507, so this was way before Amerigo visited America. And as this voyage included some of the name Americ and called the land America, Hudd put two and two together and theorized that this could be where the name actually comes from, as it predates Vespucci's voyages and Wärtsilä's map. However, it doesn't actually predate Vespucci's voyages or Wärtsilä's map. The 1496 city record Hudd pointed to as evidence had been lost, and Hudd was actually using a record from 1564 that summarized the lost 1497 record. By 1565, America was a commonly used name for the New World, so in summarizing the 1497 record, the name was retroactively used, hence why it seemed like the name America was in use before Amerigo's travels. And just to add to this, that 1565 record was destroyed in a 1560 fire, so the evidence that America was named after Richard Emmerich comes from an old lost document that talked about an even older lost document. I'm sure you can see why this etymology is so thoroughly debunked, despite how plausible it seems. Once again, America and Emmerich sounding similar is just a big old coincidence. So it seems pretty conclusive that America is named after Amerigo Vespucci, but nevertheless these folk etymologies about the Americu people/mountains and Richard Emmerich are pretty fun stories, despite the fact they aren't true. As I said, I do really enjoy folk etymologies. They're fun to look at and see how human brains have come to somewhat logical conclusions for word origins. However, like I also said, when we talk about folk etymologies, we must emphasize that this is a folk etymology and not mistake it for the truth and spread misinformation. Sometimes folk etymologies are hard to detect, so always have your wits about you when hearing any information you might find suspicious, especially from tools like myself blabbering away on the internet. I'm not a valid source of information, but my sources hopefully are. We live in a time where false information is more rife than ever, and sometimes there can even be false information in our etymologies. Thank you to all my patrons who support Name Explain on a monthly basis. Name Explain depends on small monthly donations from fans like you to help keep the channel running. Just a small amount of $2 a month helps in a huge way, grants you patron exclusive Name Explain extras, and gets your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you. Hello all, and thank you so much for reaching the end of the video. Check out another video and subscribe to stay in the loop on all things Name Explain. You can follow myself on Twitter at NameExplainYT. Follow me there and tweet the name Christopher at me so you came from this message. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.